Hey everybody. So few things before we get started. This is module 5. We are going to be talking about the media, which means we're going to be talking about and looking at some imagery that is not so fabulous. I will not show any imagery that depicts specific types of violence. However, because we are talking about the sexualization of women and sexualities within this section, there are going to be some imagery that does sexualize women in ways that we are going to talk about that can be harmful. On top of that, I am still kind of recovering from a back injury, so excuse the pillow behind me. I apologize for that. And let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen and we'll rock this out. All right. Of course, it's got to load. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start in the media, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about the sexualization of bodies within the media, but we're also going to talk about visibility in the media and imagery overall for specific groups in the media. And so we'll kind of touch base on a lot of things. And I have a lot of imagery on here because I think when we talk about media, having those examples in front of us kind of helps us to understand and look for the things in which we're talking about. But note that some of them are a little ridiculous because, again, we have ridiculous, especially when it comes to advertising. Ridiculous imagery. So when we talk about the media, we need to understand that language matters, and we need to understand that within media, language matters. And so the way characters talk to each other within movies or shows, or the ways in which we depict how you can talk to a specific group, or the slurs you can use, the slurs you can't use, the terminology that you use that may or may not be outdated, and some things. All of this language is part of our media, and it depicts and represents and maintains the hierarchical structures that are embedded within our culture. And specifically, we're going to talk about how language is gendered and how those gendered imageries are due to this relate back to this heteronormativity idea, because we are looking at things through a male gaze, and the male gaze is assumed to be straight, which would mean that they would want to or would desire women. And specifically, it is cis men desiring cis women. And so we'll get into that a little bit more when we go through here too. But it's reinforcing, again, those social hierarchies, that idea that to be heterosexual is the social norm, that to be male is and is more powerful, and those imageries thus are for you. And it talks about, and it's not just, right, it's not just gender, it's also race. When you look at these pictures up here of the Rolling Stone, and when we're talking about sexism, this is one of those pictures that pops up. It's that comparison of Rolling Stone covers that it talked about in your books. But notice that the women and the men in this are all white, right? And that's going to be a pretty consistent theme. Also, when we talk about the media imageries we have in advertisements, which is it's getting better, but it's definitely not where it should be. And the items that we do see on mainstream media sites, or the advertisements we do stream, also are geared towards white individuals. They're not geared towards, like when you look at hair care products, you're not going to see a whole lot of hair care products specifically catered to Black bodies or to indigenous persons clothing options, or you're not going to see specific things that are cultural to outside of mainstream white ideologies. And that is intentional, right? It's to maintain that hierarchy, to maintain what is the norm, maintain what is powerful. And those things are slowly, fingers crossed, being broken down. But are they being broken down in meaningful ways? And that's kind of what we're going to get into a lot more as we move through this particular section. When we talk about sex and magazines, we're going to talk a lot about the how-to columns, and like, why are all the how-to columns geared towards women and how to please men? You don't see a whole lot of male magazines or male articles that are geared towards how to please women. And again, that social construction or social assumption is heteronormativity. It is straightness. And so if you don't fall in those lanes, how do those apply to you? And in what ways would you want, even desire to read or be part of that marketing strategy, right? Who is invisible, essentially? And then again, we're going to get into this hypersexualization and this idea that it excessively represents narrow ideas of sexual appeal. And it puts that sexuality or that sexiness as that main quality, that quality that matters the most, right, in your content. And then symbolic annihilation is that idea that when imagery or language in media is systemically ignoring, trivializing, or distorting a specific group. And so you're going to see this in the way of what kind of representations there are of specific marginalized populations and what ways that keeps that population marginalized, right? And we'll get into that when we get into some of the stereotyping ideas throughout imagery. And so we're also going to talk about advertising, because advertising, and then sexual objectification, meaning to reduce someone or something, some living thing, to an object for the use of some kind of sexual pleasure, denoting their worth through the sexualization. So you're looking at the idea that that particular body is specific and only specific for someone else's pleasure, not their own, not even necessarily consensual. This is just an object and it's there for me to enjoy, and that's it, period. Now, we're going to talk about why and how that plays into gendered, racialized, and other kind of notions of hierarchies, and why it's important to really look at who's being objectified in what ways and what that means for those people. And then we're going to have a discussion about how sexual violence enters the media, how the narrative of sexual violence gets shaped by the media, and how they shape the victim. And we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get into movies and film, and a little bit when we get into advertising. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the next spot. We're going to go into imagery. Remember, there's a lot of mixed messaging. There's a lot of hypersexuality. They talk about, again, the heteronormativity that's going to be throughout all of this. And these are things to kind of think of. Who is the media made for? It's made for straight male gaze. It's made for whiteness. It's made with the intentional audience of a white straight male. And that means something, right? That means something about the media that we create. It means something about the media we consume. And it means something about how this media shapes our ideologies. And then we talk about who makes the media. There's a super big discrepancy on invisibility, and it's linked to the demographics of who makes media. Most of media is still controlled and made by specific companies with specific CEOs that are specifically white older males. And this matters, right? Because we wonder why this gaze looks like this. The gaze is going to look like this if this is who's creating the media, because there is no other alternative lens, because we are only seeing the lens through those who are creating it. And this is why supporting projects that are made for and by and through the lens of other identities becomes so valuable and so important, because these representations of life are not inaccurate. They're not necessarily wrong. They're just a different lens. And those lenses will create this idea that one specific social norm is not accurate. Okay. And so we need to do better about having media that's made by more than one specific type of identity. And I think like a good example of this is Black Panther, right? So when that movie was being made, there was so much pushback about the fact that it was made by Black people, produced by Black people, starred Black people. And they just kept saying, well, this is not going to be mainstream marketable. You know, the audience that we cater media to, which is this white straight male gaze, is not going to come watch this movie. And it was wrong. It was wrong. It did amazing. And people really, really loved it. And not just that, but it gave view and visibility and life to a beautiful story that didn't center whiteness. And that in and of itself is, right, history making. And it's something that as we move forward in media, we're going to have to look and see how much of that continues to keep being made, and keep being able to be that mainstream, have the money behind it. Because we've had media from all of these different marginalized groups for a long period of time. The difference is what money gets put back behind it, what advertising gets put, where those outlets end up becoming. Do they go directly to like streaming sources? Do they go directly to DVD? I know that shows my age a little bit, but like, are these medias going straight to the source in the same way, or held up in the same way that media sources are that are made for that white male gaze by white older men, right? And then we're gonna again talk about how ability, age, gender, all of these things are tied into what becomes the media, what becomes the norm within the media, right? And we're going to start with kids media. It's one of those things that makes me a little crazy because I have kids, and you have to really think about what your kids watch, because the imagery and the things that happen in those movies are how they think the world works. That's their representation of what the world works. And so there are just so many different examples here, right? But there is so much sexualization of female bodies within everything. You just have, for example, let's use Disney princess movies, okay? And again, they're getting a little better, a little better. We now don't have to have every single princess have a prince, which is amazing, but again, and there's a little bit more powerful, and they're a little more covered up, which is wonderful. My generation did not have that. I think we had Princess Jasmine that's up here. Let me move me. Princess Jasmine that's up here having to seduce the bad guy in order to get him to pay attention to her so that Aladdin can get to the lamp, right? These things mean something, right? They become subconscious messaging to explain what it is that women's worth are, what they have to offer the world. And so much of that was, how do we seduce men? But it also teaches men how to attract women. You have to be white, you have to be rich, you have to be good looking, you have to be a prince, right? Like, standards that were not necessarily there, right? And then you just like the sexualization of Babs Bunny in any of the Space Jam movies, which it got a little better in the most recent one, but not great. You have scenes like this in movies where like it is very clear that certain situations are happening. And while you think that kids miss these little memos, they're still trying to figure out what's happening, right? Their brains are still creating stories. And most of them, again, they're not going to catch necessarily all the sexual innuendos, but they will understand that they're like, they will put it together when they get a little older. And those things, those messagings will still create ideas of what women's worth are, what they're good at, what their purpose is. It'll also display things that are non-consensual, and it displays things like, I don't know, being kissed when you're asleep to bring you back to life, being pushed up against a door and very much not listening to no's. Things like all moms have big, huge butts. Okay. Like, why do her hips have to be that big? Like, I just don't understand. And then again, we're going to also talk about ages here, right? Some of these Disney princesses, most of them were underage. So while granted, when some of them were made, that was a little bit more common, even throughout the times when they aren't, like, these are very, very young kids making very, very, very big decisions and being sexualized in ways that make us need to stop and think for a second about how our media is being portrayed and what it matters. I mean, I love Avatar, don't get me wrong. I think it's amazing. But we have scenes of, like, the main core plot line is a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old who go throughout life. I think they're 13 and 16 maybe at the end, and end up like with this romantic plot line. They could just be kids going out to save the world, but there has to be this romance. Like, why is that a necessary feature, and what is it telling these people? And then you get into the, ones when you get a little older that are more centered around what our lovely reality TV kind of shows show, and why that matters. We have the sexualization of very, very, very young girls. I think one of the biggest things that struck me about this is when one of the moms dressed up their little girl and had them do a spot to the song that's in Pretty Woman, and had them dress up like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. For those of you who do not know that movie, she is a prostitute who ends up deciding that, like a self-labeled prostitute who ends up deciding to woo a rich man, and they fall in love in life and stuff and things. But they dressed up one of their toddlers as her to sing to this song, which again, the disconnect here between the messaging and what that really means for those girls and what it means for the girls who are watching this. There's just a disconnect there that I think that if we can pick apart, we should, because it matters. And then you've got your 16 and pregnant, which kind of idealizes this idea that, and it's not to say that being 16 and pregnant makes you automatically have done something wrong, but to idealize that can put young girls at risk of serious economic and social inequality, because that life is not easy, and that path is not easy, both on the body, both on the human, both on the life path. And it's something that, as we move forward in our messaging to all of our kids, you also don't see a lot of you don't see any of the dads on that screen, and there's a reason for that, right? They're in the show, but you don't see them at the front of the screen, because again, the ideas that are behind that are the pregnant person is the woman's going to have these social issues, the woman's going to be the one that has the cost, right? And it's kind of denoting that. And then I also put 13 Reasons Why in here, because it is technically a young adult show, but that in and of itself I could do a whole lecture on that show. I'm not going to, but just again, when we talk about how teen sex is portrayed in the media, when we talk about the consequences for that, when we talk about sexual violence in the media, things like this need to be part of the conversation, because while it does show that there is negative outcomes for that, the main core plot line for this was sexual violence, and it's something that is labeled a youth show. And that in and of itself, whether it's kind of dissecting it or not, is something that we need to be mindful of. Now, on the positive side, I also put She-Ra on here because there is some beautiful queer visibility in She-Ra. There is queer parenting in She-Ra. There is a lot of drama, but there is some very positive abilities to have visibility in youth programming that in my age didn't necessarily happen. We had to kind of, I don't know, queer things ourselves, or make things happen that weren't necessarily apparent. This is very apparent. It's very out there. It's very on point. And I think that that's important to kind of mention, that there is that ability to see some of the changes that are happening now. So again, I could talk about this for all day, but I'm going to keep going because there's a lot to talk about. Music videos. Okay. I picked music videos from every freaking genre I could think of. This is, I'm going to say this, and I want you to hear this. This is not a single genre issue. It is framed in the media, in all sorts of things, as a single genre of R&B and rap music are killing the morality of teens, blah, 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 blah. It's BS. There is female sexualization in every single genre. There is female empowerment in every single genre. There is invisibility of queer people in every genre. There is queer people excelling in every genre. Okay. There is this notion of sex sells in music and in media in general. And so there's this idea that there's this twofold thing happening, where women are being used as props, as sexual objects within music videos, and then women are flipping the script on that and saying, yeah, I can do that, but I can also be empowered in doing that because it can be my choice and I can do it the way I want to. And I can be proud of what that means. Right. And so there are moments where I think like blurred lines where the song itself is icky, or like if you really want to go down a rabbit hole of not fun, I'm going to get all the content warnings for this, all the content warnings, but like Maroon 5's music video for Animals, it's down here at the bottom. Like, again, I'm not going to go into how ridiculously awful that music video is. All the content warnings, stalking, just lots of not okayness. But the fact that this is part of our mainstream media with our popular music entities, like, matters, right? And it also matters that there is pushback and this ability for women to turn it on its head and say, yeah, but on the flip side, I can be who I want to be in this video and make it work. Or for queer people to come in and be like, and I can make videos with me and other women, or I can make videos of a man and a man and you can deal with it. Like, or I can be sexy when I'm pregnant, or I can be sexy in every body shape, right? Like, there is power in changing that messaging. There is power in flipping the script and queering the script. We just kind of also have to deal with the fact that in doing that, we're still giving those same imageries. We're still catering to a specific audience. We're still catering to a male gaze. So you can do that and show women empowerment. The problem is that how much or how little is that changing the dynamic or the ability to not do that? And that we're just not really sure as scientists how much of that empowerment or women holding up and like catering to that and or the queer spaces that live within that are really breaking down those structural inequalities that are built into these music videos. So again, just food for thought. I don't take a line one way or the other. I do think that there are times like Blurred Lines or like Maroon 5's videos that it explicitly goes into sexual violence or the non-consensual ideas in imagery. And when that happens, I think we've got to a point where there is no ability to have empowerment in that. And that is just crossing lines that we as humans need to be more mindful of not supporting, if that makes sense. And then let's go into advertising. Oh, the advertising. Poof. I'm just gonna say that. So I put in here like a mass variety of different kinds of things that were being advertised in different kind of outlets, right? So you got everything from PETA to movies to perfumes to sandwiches to Dove, right? Okay. And notice that there's like a pretty common theme, right? There's naked women everywhere. And that's like, and again, you're also going to see men sexualized in ways too, but generally they're not going to be sexualized in the same ways. You're also going to see, when you do see women of color, they're generally hypersexualized, or you're going to see them denoted as like sort of erotic or like exotic in ways. And that has its own kind of thing in and of itself to really talk and break down. And when we talk about advertising, so much you'll hear, well, it's about sex. Sex sells. We have to put in the sexy. We have to do this. I am not entirely sure what a Burger King sandwich has to do with sex, but for whatever reason, that's the messaging that, again, the people who make ads seem to keep following. Now, mind you, who is predominantly making those ads? And this is going to be the same thing we talked about prior, right? Like, who is making these ads matters into what gets made. And then you're also going to be looking at the body styles, right? Like, who gets to be considered beautiful? You're not going to see a single disabled person on this page. Why? Because it's really hard to find ads that consistently have them, and especially have them in any kind of lens that is not catering to a specific type of, like, I don't know, medication. Or if it's not an advertisement for medications, it's an advertisement for like the help I've fallen button or something of that nature. You're not going to see disabled bodies predominantly in mainstream media and advertising, because that's not who they're trying to cater to, right? That's not the audience that they think they're catering to. And that's not an audience that they want to have any kind of like part of the beauty, the ideal beauty, or the ideal social norm. I'm going to draw attention to the one in the middle right here. This is again another example of how race plays parts in advertising, right? So you're going to see that the white woman is sitting there looking fairly empowered, while the Black woman is opening up her shirt, and there's this very eroticized sexualization of her. Now, there's also consequences for the body images that are put in here and the messaging that's put in here. And that we've gone into several things when we talk about body image, when we talk about media, it has consequences on not just the female body too, though it has consequences on the male body as well. Because when there's a standard of what a body is supposed to look like that is primarily unachievable for the vast majority of the population, there gets to be these like self-doubts, these ways of creating harmful self-images that are supposed to live up to those standards. And that's not healthy for a number of ways, but it does contribute to a large number of mental health issues, and even physical health issues when you get into things like anorexia, bulimia, some of those kinds of things, cutting, all sorts of destructive self-harm behaviors that come out of this desire to be something or a body style that they are not. I will say that there has been some change in this. So when you look up at the Dove ad, when you look at the ad over here with the volleyball player, like I think it's volleyball. Yeah. You're going to see that there are some changes, right? Some things are going to be showing some more diversity. You're going to see ads that have different body styles, and that is great. That is progress. That is better than what I had maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. On the flip side of that, there has to be more, right? It has to be the norm to show body styles that are diverse, that are changing. And those body styles also have to include disabled bodies. They have to include neurodivergent bodies. They have to include a wide range of understandings so that we can accurately represent human in all of its forms, if that makes sense. And these images are used to control us. They're used to control what it is we should be striving for, what it is we should be looking for, and what matters. We're going to get into fashion. I'm going to be brief on this because it's very similar to the same things we just talked about in advertising. That ideal body image. I will talk about the fact that in fashion advertising specifically, you've got your big brands, Dolce & Gabbana, you've got Gucci, you've got, I know that Steve Madden and Tommy Hilfiger have both gotten in trouble too. There's a fairly consistent theme of female sexual violence that runs through these, and or like sexual power and control that comes through some of these ads that has been given a significant amount of time and space and activism to try to compensate or change that. Now, whether or not that's actually changing, I think time will really tell, but there has been a large amount of pushback for those imageries. I will say that on top of like having very thin, very white models. We're also seeing a change in the fashion industry to some extent, of body styles, of body shapes. And I think that this is also a very queer space, right? So there's fashion is a very much an ability to queer who you are, how you present yourself, in what ways. And in that ways, there's always been queerness when it comes to the fashion industry, and how it embodies, I guess, queer personhood and the ability to queer oneself. Um, Again, you do see some change. You would have never seen pictures like these in magazines, in women's fashion, say, I don't know, maybe 50, 70 years ago. So fashion has significantly changed. You are seeing a significantly more body styles that are being produced, definitely more racial identities within those. You do see fashion also as a place for androgyny. You see fashion for a place to put gender on its head. And so there is that, and that is good, and that is changing, and to an extent that has always been there. And so while fashion does have, again, it's very negative things when it comes to body image, it comes to its skinniness, comes to its sexualization of women's bodies. You also have always had fashion that pushes the boundaries, that breaks down some of those stereotypes. And the last thing we're going to talk about is video games. I know we have a couple of video game people in this class. We are a video game household as well. So I just wanted to real quickly and briefly talk about visibility and kind of imagery within this particular framework. You're going to see a lot of sexualized women in video games. And it's something that those who play significant amounts of video games have consistently been bringing up, right? This is where a lot of activism has been. You will see a lot of women as props, a lot of women as things that can be victimized and done violence to. I did not, this picture down in the corner is the most I would show, but there are more graphic displays of that. Grand Theft Auto has all sorts of it in there. You have lots and lots and lots of games that I won't put on here that depict violence against women, and that violence against women is particularly part of the game. That in and of itself has sprung a lot of conversations within those who play video games, and within the platforms as well. And still a male gaze, but there is a ever growing portion of women that do play video games consistently, and those have called for change in how the characters. And I think one of the biggest indicators that change is happening within this structure is when you look at Lara Croft via the game down here at the bottom. This is the evolution of the Lara Croft character and how she looks. And when you start to look at there at the end, we are getting somewhere. So no one is fighting crime looking like this. Okay. I'm just saying that it's highly impractical, and you're going to be all sorts of mosquitoes in the areas that you don't want them if you're going to be out in the wilderness looking like this. I'm just saying. But you're also going to see changes in the way of queer characters. You're getting a lot more storylines where they have queer characters. And you get a lot more characters that represent a more wide class of racial and ethnic identities. Now, to an extent, you're going to find that anyway, just because video games aren't necessarily all human. You're going to find very different kinds of, I don't know, depictions of what female could or could not be. And then you're also, I think it's interesting that as there are many, many games that sex is part of the video game or is a plot line or is a back plot or is in one of the cutscenes or what have you. And really how that is being done, in what ways that is getting queered, in what ways it is moving towards, or you have the ability to commit violence against women, and what ways those things are being are less than, I guess, what they were. So really just kind of thinking about, as you're playing video games, as you're seeing these imageries, what those imageries mean, why it matters, that there's a more wide variety of female, what it would matter to have those females, I don't know, have normal size proportions, or characters that would have dress that would actually make sense for whatever it is they're doing. Um, and I do think there are more representations of that than there used to be. But I do think that it is interesting to also see where androgyny plays in, where sexuality plays into these characters and their stories. So just kind of some food for thought. I think this will be interesting as we go through some of our discussions, because I would guess that some of you are going to get into that. I'm going to stop here and then we'll go back into visibility on the next lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that there's a lot of imagery in this one, so please take care of yourself and give yourself room to process and kind of think through some of these implications that we're talking about. All right, have a good one.